Okay. It's been a really long time since I have read these teachings, and so it's been really nice to sink back into this after too long for me. All right, so it's 4 p.m. for me, so I'm going to go ahead and start. And so hello, everybody, and if you're listening, thank you for listening. And I think this is episode 21. I'm not entirely sure. And just have to warn from the get-go that still got cold voice, so pretty scratchy. And I'm not on the microphone that I said I would be on, so I'm going to do my best to not have slap back from my gaming microphone today. I'm excited to report that we are on chapter 3. Woot, woot. So yeah, we're going to be getting into the Eightfold Path and right view. And so if you're following along in the book, that is page 112. And I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in here. And I do have a guest today. I'm happy to see. So I'll do my best to just check the chat. You know, that if you've got anything that you want to comment on, or if you want to jump in, just feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt me. That's totally okay to do. Okay, so right view. Right view is the first factor of the path. The Pāli term for right view, now, and forgive my pronunciation, I do my best, samaditi, and I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, can also be translated as right opinion. Right view consists of the views and opinions needed to guide your progress on the path, to understand what to do and why to do it. In this sense, right view is a series of working hypotheses that guide the path and, at the same time, will be put to the test as the path progresses. In my experience, that is true. All right. The reason why the path starts with right view rather than with right knowledge is indicated by the Buddhist's analogy in Sutta 3. He sees people who don't know where they're going, taking paths that lead to different destinations. From his perspective, he knows from direct experience where the paths go. But he can't share that direct experience with others, nor can he show them what's at the end of the paths without their reaching those destinations on their own. For them, the information they learn from him about the path is, until they reach the end of the paths themselves, simply a matter of opinion. Oh, wow. That is just an absolute, that's a delicious gem right there. This came up in this Discord server. I know I often use this wonderful community here in Meditation Mind as an example because, yeah, there are so many examples from life that you can find, I think, that can be found in these teachings as well. There was a guest speaker that came last week, and it was lovely, and he led us through a body scan meditation, and then, just kind of talked about his approach. He's a Zen, I think he's a monk, Zen Buddhist monk. I'm not sure if he's a monk, but he does practice Zen Buddhism, a longtime practitioner. And at one point, I can't remember, somebody asked a question. I think we were in the Q&A part of the talk at the very end, and I can't remember what the question or statement was, but this guest speaker kind of went on to say that, if you do practice, these teachings, that you do see for yourself things that maybe could be considered supernatural, or certainly will, as we say in the US, blow your mind. And yeah, my mind has definitely been blown. But yeah, no one's going to buy into that, right? Especially if you're more secular. I live in the US, and the US is definitely becoming more and more secular every year. And there are definitely regions on the globe, on this ball, that are definitely more secular. And, try telling a secular person that. And of course they're gonna sneer, they're gonna roll their eyes, yeah, sure, that's just your opinion. And nobody could possibly argue with that. And that's the beautiful paradox in Buddhism, right? Is that it's all fabrication. So if that's true, then I guess you're right. It is my opinion, right? It's certainly just, it's my experience, right? And and it's only my experience. And so I think what he's getting here at is what he gets at over and over again, which is, and it's one of the many, many things that I have always loved about Buddhism, and when I found it as a young woman, and I'm so glad that I found it, is that, and I'm also grateful about how I found it, and I don't even remember exactly who said it or where I heard it. It was one of those salient, where there's so many different kind of sayings about, how, what, when the student is ready, the teacher appears, is one of the sayings. But, there's a lot of sayings like that. And I think I was just open. And one of the first things I really, really heard in my heart in my early days of Buddhism, and in the beginning for me, it was Tibetan Buddhism, was completely went against my grain, because I came up in the West, and I came up in a atheist, quite frankly, home. It was not a religious home. And so to kind of come up in really kind of, I would say, a very religious, because, Buddhism is religious, and, was really kind of very counter to my cultural conditioning, which I've talked about before. But I think what kept me there was that I heard in the teachings, you don't have to take my word for it. In fact, don't take anybody's word for it. This is a plan, the Eightfold Path is a plan of action. It's available to anyone. This particular map is available to anyone. And given my conditioning, that was exactly what I needed to hear to stay. And I'm just really glad that I stayed. Everybody's got to find their own path. Obviously, Buddha had a profound experience, and so he's very definitive when he speaks. In this is an English translation of the Pāli Canon, but again, I realize there's a bridge there. It's not pure, but there's so much repetition there. I think when you read these suttas, this idea that, look, man, this is a path of action. Don't listen to anything. Just do it. Look, I could tell you, you go back and you look at an earlier sutta. I think it's the road to Radhaga, and he's telling his son or one of his students, who's complaining about how his student's student is, just not doing what he's supposed to be doing, not what he's, quote unquote, supposed to be doing. And, Buddha's just like, look, man, all you can really do is just say, hey, that's the road that I took. So just stay on that road. And that's really all that you can do. And the reason why it's okay to not get hung up on it and to not slip into this need to try to change people and force people to be there is because of this sentiment. For them, the information they learned from him about the paths is, until they reach the end of the paths themselves, simply a matter of opinion. It's all opinion in Buddhism. It's all fabrication in Buddhism. There isn't a self in Buddhism. It's all opinion. It's all kind of, I'm just going to check the chat real quick and see if there's anybody. All right. Okay. I'm just going to keep on trucking here. That is why, as a first step on the Noble Eightfold Path, right view has to be taken on conviction. On conviction. This fact is included in the definition of mundane right view, which we talked about in earlier sections, or I should say, he talks about in earlier sections, and I read and talked about, gave my peanut gallery 2 cents on for long periods of time, as I am wont to do. Let me read that again. This fact is included in the definition of mundane right view. The conviction that there are those who know through direct knowledge the truths about karma and rebirth, Sutta 48, but it underlies the more advanced levels of right view as well. On the transcendent level of right view, for instance, many of the principles of the Four Noble Truths, such as the principle that suffering is inherent in the mind's feeding habits, are counterintuitive. Even the value judgment implicit in the Four Noble Truths, that the suffering caused by clinging is the important spiritual problem, is something that can't be proven until you've solved the problem for yourself. This is why these truths have to be taken on faith before they can be put to use. Oh, I just have to savor this for a second. So I'm just going to kind of skim it quietly for myself for a second. And because you're on the live call here, I always edit out my long silences. So forgive me for as I think about this. The term feeding has been mentioned only once in the book so far, and I believe it was in the introduction or maybe the first section of chapter 1. And I really like the word feeding. I'm really glad that it's used again here. Maybe, this is right now at the beginning of the chapter. These are, this is Bhikkhu's, I believe it's his kind of notes, his setup, if you will. And then we get into actually reading the suttas. So this idea that it's counterintuitive to really believe that most of our suffering that we experience, most of that really is happening because of what we are habitually exposing our sensory experience to, the 5 aggregates. I think the best, to my mind, in 2025, the best example of this idea of this sentiment, I'm going to try to use this as an example of this sentiment, is the concept of the doom scroll. The doom scroll. So let's say someone decides that they're going to take up, meditation is all over, right? Buddhism doesn't have a flag in the ground on meditation, right? It's all over in all traditions. There's all kind, right? But in the Eightfold Path, okay, in this particular tradition, when you start getting into right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness, right, and these kind of ways of getting access to those jhanas and kind of climbing up those jhanas, and when you start, anyway, I don't want to get too far down that range there, okay? But as you start to train the mind and train the body, it's kind of like train the mind body. That's why the body scan is really such a big feature. I'm assuming, I talked about this last week, in Goenka's approach to Vipassana, right? If you go to that Goenka retreat, it's really popular in the US, and you spend a lot of time, most of the time in meditation, like 9 hours a day of meditation, right? You're scanning the body in a very systematic way. So I'm guessing it's because when you train the mind body like that, then it becomes really sensitive. It becomes really, really sensitive. And forgive this if this just feels too out there for you, and I know I'm not the person who invented this analogy at all, but this might just be too out there for some people. Just, humor me. Radio, a good old-fashioned terrestrial FM dial, AM dial radio. And you're tuning the radio to find a station that can come in that you can hear. So let's say that as you practice right concentration and right mindfulness, what you're doing is you're becoming your mind body is becoming very sensitive. It's almost like you can pick up on more frequencies. I know this just sounds really out there, so people are probably going to think I'm a crackpot. That's okay. Buddhism is out there, man. Nobody said it wasn't. But in all seriousness, okay, so think about that for a second. If you've tuned your body to be really receptive to the frequencies, then you start to see for yourself that this is true. And I might not get very far today in the reading, and I'm okay with that, because to me, this concept right here is so critical to really kind of turning on the light switch. The suffering is inherent in the mind's feeding habits. And so when your body mind becomes more sensitive, let's say you're doom scrolling. Let's say that you're on TikTok. Let's say it's 3:00 in the morning and you're on the TikTok, and it began with something really, fun and completely benevolent and kind of maybe even inane, which is great. It's not doing a lot to kick up emotions. But let's say at some point, because we're asleep, right? When most of us are asleep all the time, unless you're training the mind, we're asleep. And so you're scrolling. Now you kind of checked out. And if you haven't really been training the mind, you might even be now looking at things that aren't maybe not making you feel so good, but because you don't have a good, sharp, tuned in kind of body mind, you don't realize that you're feeling bad. Cut to an hour later, 2 hours later, and you're anxious and you're upset and everybody's out to get you and everybody's your enemy and you don't want to leave the house and you think that that story is true. You think that that story is true. It's a lie. It's a lie because you've been feeding your mind crap. So actually what you feed your aggregates is really important. And again, that's introduced in the beginning of the book. This idea of feeding and the 5 aggregates. And, again, go back and look at the introduction, talks about the aggregate of form. We're familiar with this idea of our aggregate of in psychology, right? I'm studying psychology. So if you're a psychologist or you want to look this up and you're more interested in maybe forget about Buddhism, just show me something that's scientific. If you consider psychology scientific, go check out embodied cognition. That would be the aggregate of form. What does that mean? That means that how we fabricate reality is conditioned by how our body experiences reality. So I'm blessed with, terrible, but I can see, eyesight. I can hear, hearing. I can taste. I can smell. I have all my limbs. All of that has a part to play in how I experience reality. If I lost my legs and I lost my arms, I would become a different person, right? Your experience of reality would be different. And this goes far beyond something that radical, that dramatic, right? I mean, anything can really shift and change one's perspective, right? I live in Los Angeles right now. The day that the people woke up, or when someone wakes up the day before a war starts in a place, they didn't wake up thinking, man, I better get ready for that fire today. Man, I better change my whole mind today because a fire is going to be, we're not capable of doing that. Nevertheless, the human that had a house yesterday, let's call that person Jill. She had a house yesterday, and in 2 hours, that house was gone. Jill is a different person now. Jill is now someone who experiences great loss, great grief. She's changed. So I know I went on and on and on. I'm going to check the chat. Okay. And sometimes I do that. If you've listened to the podcast, sometimes it's like I get one page in, but this sentiment is so important to me. I think it's the meat and potatoes, or if you're vegetarian, it's the tofu and potatoes of Buddhism. It's the 4 noble truths, but right view. The 4 noble truths is right view. Life is suffering. And how is it suffering? This, right? And then it becomes much more esoteric as well. And that's where it can become very difficult. For me as well, because I'm a Westerner that grew up in an atheist home, so I'm going to move on. Similarly, with the ultimate level of right view, the judgment that eventually you have to abandon even the most skillful qualities of the mind goes against the grain when you've put so much effort into developing them. So the wisdom of this judgment, too, has to be taken on faith. But in every case, the faith required is not a blind faith in unreasonable ideas. Instead, the reasonableness of the Buddhist teachings is presented as one of the signs that it is worthy of faith, as is the fact that each person is invited to test the teachings in practice for him or herself. But to test them, you have to trust that they are worth the time and effort needed to give them a fair try. And I like that, a fair try. And I think that's a really good word to use here. I find I've been practicing this for maybe 26. I'm aging myself here, and that's okay. That's right. I'm in my 50s, maybe 26 this years. And I love this because what I found for myself, and I know why I stick to it, is because there is a quality to practicing Buddhism, because a lot of people that you meet that decide, because it's not like, not everybody, I might offend people here, but it's in the teachings, man, that you're not born into Buddhism. Buddhism is a practice. It's a decision. Buddhism is a decision. It's like I'm going to try to, I'm going to, and I realize that some monastics would say it's not possible to practice Buddhism as a layperson. What I do believe is that you can give it a effing your best shot. I have been for the past 26, 27 years, and I don't know. Who knows? Maybe I'll be lucky enough when I, come closer to my death, which could be any day, right? But if I have any warning about it, then I would be just love it if I could become a monastic. But I am a lay person. I have a job. I have a husband. Long marriage, long happy marriage. Thank you, Buddhism, and other things. So why does he say give it a fair try? Because it's hard, because a lot of it is counterintuitive, like is being said here. And for me, I had to kind of do some weird kind of like, for lack of a better word, psychic breakage needed to happen for me. In other words, when you meditate, when you kind of practice some of this stuff and you kind of get into some of these jhanas that are going to be described throughout the book, and you stick with it. At the beginning of the book, in the introduction, it talks about, your mind is a fire. It's on fire. It's a building on fire. And Buddhism is a map to the fire escape, and I love that because really it does feel like you're sitting on fire. And this morning when I sat, I felt like I was sitting on fire. I have arthritis in my hip. I sit on physical pain fire every day. And I'm not recommending that people do that. Please hear this. Okay. I'm not a doctor. I've been to many doctors. This isn't going to hurt me. It's not, there's nothing really, I'm not going to bore you with the details. Please see your doctor, et cetera, et cetera. Disclaimer here. There is a certain amount of, you just have to be willing to be uncomfortable. I just started, I bumped up my meditation to an hour a day on here. I was doing 40 minutes and I couldn't make it today. The arthritis was just too bad. There's a teacher that I love, Joseph Goldstein. Was it him or was it, I think it was Joseph Goldstein who said this. He's an American Western, I shouldn't say that with, how I feel. Sometimes the Westerners, I think we kind of messed up Buddhism. We haven't given a proper, pure message to people over here who really want to know about it, and how it was taught. But he said something that I think is really great advice for anybody who's taking this up and wants to give it the quote unquote fair try is, can you be willing before you sit to not get up until your mind has told you 3 times that if you don't get up right now, you're going to go crazy? Can you be willing to have that conversation with yourself 3 times? And that's basically what I do with my pain, because I've been to a doctor and I've asked them outright, look, I meditate every day. Sometimes I go on long retreats where I sit for ridiculous amounts of time. And I also try to sit, and again, but I try to sit in, what is it called? The Brahmin? I can't remember. It's not full lotus, but it's whatever. I could post a picture. Just let me know if you want one. And they told me that I could do that, but yes, can I sit on my pain and just be with the pain in my body? And my mind will tell me, you can't do this anymore. You're killing yourself here. Right. This is what the mind does. Right. Sarah, you're never going to walk. You're going to hurt yourself so bad that you're never going to walk again. This can't be right. They can't be right. This hurts too bad. This can't be right. Right. The mind. Again, disclaimer here, please. Anybody who's listening, disclaimer. This is why meditation can be dangerous, right? This is why it's a good idea to get a teacher. This is why it's a really good idea when you're messing with things like this to get a teacher. I just don't want to get in trouble, right? I don't want anybody, I'm like, right? No, man. Look, I'm just telling you, I've been to doctors. So today, my mind told me I was going to die and never walk again once. Continued sitting. Time goes by. I don't know how long. Oh my God, you got to get up now. This is not good. Come on. Okay, that was twice. Next one, I get to get up. So it's these little things that we train in. And so where it says, but to test them, you have to trust that they are worth the time and effort needed to give them a fair try. I think in the West, we're very much a culture of reaching the goal, There's something that I want, and I want it, and I'm going to get it. And where are the steps I need to take to get it? And great, these are my steps. Now I'm going to take these steps, and now I'm going to have it. When can I have it? Maybe if I do more steps, I'll have it faster, right? Just very counter to Buddhist view. Very counter to a Buddhist approach to experience. Buddhism, there is just now. There's just now. When I've taught, I used to teach college, and I maybe will again. I used to teach meditation, though, to my students back when COVID happened, because here in the United States, people were stressed out, man. The campuses were closing. People had to move online, try to learn online. Some students were more tech savvy than others and had more access than others and knew more about it than others. And they requested, there was a real genuine desire for this. And I get their doubt. I get the doubt that, that a lot of people have about, I get it. I totally get, someone saying, wait a minute, desire is a great thing. And I agree. I mean, I haven't read these teachings in a long time, so I don't want to talk about desire right now, because I like to put things on a really fine point on things and be very specific. And so I don't want to quite get to the word right now, but I'll just say that it's kind of right desire. So, and here's where, maybe it starts to cross over with concepts in psychology like flow. When you start to practice things like, got to keep an eye on the time. Great. Okay. Wow. I've gotten into like one paragraph. So I'm just going to finish this thought and then I keep reading. So when you get into concepts like flow, I'm not an expert on flow. Okay. I haven't done any studies on flow. I haven't written any research on flow. I'm looking forward to, but I'm not an expert on flow. Okay. But my understanding from like the class where we talked about flow is that flow is kind of like being in the moment, right? Very Zen, very Buddhism, I think Hinduism too. I'm not sure. I don't want to speak out of turn. Maybe Taoism, I think too, right? I'm not sure. I don't want to speak out of turn, but it's very, right, like non-dualistic, non-duality, very, this is it, this is all it. So my understanding is that flow is that coupled with effort, kind of effort, but also kind of effort with an a priori of the skill already developed. Well, that's meditation, so I remember the first time I taught meditation to a dear fellow, a dear friend that I haven't talked to in a long time, an amazing, kind, warm human. And so we were doing a silent meditation, and I was just kind of teaching them a basic kind of concentration meditation that I had learned in my local Sangha, years ago. And it was just breathe naturally. And, I explained that, in this particular tradition, we're usually breathing in through the nose and out through the nose, and just put your attention right at your nostrils. I was explaining, and this was guided, so every 5 minutes or so, I would say, hey, just check it in, kind of noticing where your mind is, noticing if you're thinking, remembering, planning, worrying, feeling angry. I should have said this. I can't believe she said that. Oh my God, did I forget to turn off the stove, right? So, and then no problem. That's the nature of mind, I said. Just see if you can bring your attention right on back to that breath at your nose, right? So we did this for a while, and then afterwards we went around, and, does anybody feel like, talking about how it was, challenges, things that came up for you? And when we got to this particular person, they said, oh, I had a great meditation. And I was like, wow, do you want to talk about, what it was like? And they're like, yeah. And they proceeded to talk about what they were thinking about. Oh, I got all these great ideas for this project that I was working on. It's this idea of we can't know what we don't know, right? So in his mind, he thought he was following my instructions, but he was thinking. So who knows how long he actually stayed with his breath, if he ever did, right? And now if he chose to stay with meditation and he just stayed with it, he gave it, he decided to trust that it was worthy of the time and effort needed to give it a fair try, then he would move from that to, oh, I noticed how my mind kept wanting to go to this problem that I have at work and try to solve it. And I would be like, yeah, the mind does that, right? And he'd be like, yeah, man, it was like did that like 1,000 times. And then I would be like, yeah, yeah, I've been doing this like decades and my mind still does that, yo. And he'd be like, yeah. And then if he would keep doing it for maybe like more months and maybe every day, disciplining himself, then he'd come back and he'd be like, oh man. So I have this problem at work. And it's just been really eating me up inside, What am I doing while I'm talking to you right now, even? And I don't know if you can hear my breathing, but even as I'm talking to you, I myself am dropping into my body, dropping into my stomach, exhaling all my air out of my nostrils. There's a difference there, right? There's a really big difference there. And oftentimes we don't really see that difference until we've been doing it for a while. And then, if people are willing to maybe put on the shelf this time frame, right? I need to lose that 10 pounds because my wedding is in 3 months. I need to learn how to meditate like a master because I'm going on a Vipassana retreat this summer and I want to look like a hotshot, right? See earlier sections of the book. And believe you me, see future sections of the book. So I'm going to go on. Wow, that was ridiculous, Sarah. I got very little read there. So let me check the chat, see how we're doing. I don't use names here to protect your privacy, but it is great to see you. And I've been enjoying meditating with you in the morning a lot. And thank you. And thank you for staying with me, even though I ramble. When the text define conviction, they frame it as a matter of having conviction in the Buddha's awakening, Sutta 55. In fact, the 3 levels of right view follow the pattern of the Buddha's 3 knowledges on the night of his awakening, Sutta 30. Mundane right view accepts the content of the first 2 knowledges on karma and rebirth. Transcendent right view accepts the 3rd knowledge, in which the Buddha's discovery of the 4 noble truths led to his awakening. The final level of right view, which lies beyond the transcendent, accepts a step that isn't mentioned in the standard description of the 3rd knowledge, but which the Buddha elsewhere states was a crucial stage on the path, the total abandoning of the path itself. To accept the Buddha's awakening on conviction is to accept the validity of the working hypothesis that he presents as right view. I'll try to keep this brief because I gotta at least get to a couple pages, right? So as I've mentioned over and over and over again in previous episodes, that I am nowhere near enlightened or awakened. If one does believe in Dhamma and like karmic rebirth, then I'll use this language that I remember from a very, very young age of having an unbelievable temper. And Buddhism has helped me profoundly with it. But whatever's going on with the seeds that are ripening in this life for me, anger, which is a very dangerous thing to feed in Buddhism, going back to the idea of feeding. It's one of the most dangerous things to feed in Buddhism. And I believe in Hinduism too, if I recall correctly from the little that I know. And so this is something that I get to work with repeatedly. So I'm just going to tell you outright, I can't imagine abandoning the path in this lifetime. I've had profound, yes, supernatural experiences with meditation, been meditating a very long time. The idea that I could just stop meditating altogether and stop following the path. You know what? For everybody's sake in my life, I won't be doing that in this lifetime. So I can't laugh because then I'll start coughing, but so there you go. But do I have conviction in the validity that it's possible? Yes, I do. Why? I have had a couple of experiences in my life, several. One was just kind of a thing that happened. Again, you can hear previous episodes. I think it had something to do with letting go of an addiction and kind of a weird kind of thing that happened there. The other one was from going to a crazy, hardcore retreat, and it just kind of, whoa, it was pretty gnarly. And so even this skeptic right here could go, okay, well, that was a trip. And if I would have left this retreat when my mind was trying to convince me to leave, which was 3 or 4 days ago, I would not have gotten to see this. I would not have given it a fair try. So anywho, to call right view a series of working hypotheses implies two things. On the one hand, it implies that these views are not simply idle theories, maps of reality to be merely contemplated or argued about. To be properly used, they have to be put into practice. This is reflected in the fact that each level of right view entails its own duties. I know that's not a very popular word in the West, but there it is. There's things that one needs to do. This is one of the reasons why the Buddha warns about grasping right view wrongly, say for the purpose of simply holding on to it or for getting into useless debates, because those acts would put you on a different path from the one for which right view was intended. On the other hand, calling right view a series of working hypotheses implies that the duties they entail are not simply bald imperatives, such as do this or drink me. Instead, these views provide explanations for why the duties should be done, so that they can be followed with at least some measure of understanding and a conviction that the duties are actually beneficial to attempt. That's, again, definitely been my experience with these duties. At the same time, these explanations are meant to convey not an entire map of reality, but enough of a map to keep you on the path. Remember the road to Radhika. See that road? Just take that road. Right? Too extensive a map would risk pulling your attention into side roads. Again, go back and see that sutta that lead away from the goal, which is why the Buddha was very clear about which issues he would discuss as part of right view and which he would put aside. In presenting these working hypotheses on differing levels, the Buddha took on a corresponding set of standards for how he should speak. He would say only things that were true, beneficial, and appropriate for the time and place. And that's right speech, parts of it, right? And we'll get to that later. In Sutta 175, where he presents these standards, he defines appropriate for time and place in terms of when it was appropriate to speak in a pleasing way and when to speak in a disagreeable way. But other suttas show that he would vary his teachings in response to the needs of the listeners, in other ways as well. In particular, he would gauge which level of right view was most appropriate to discuss at that particular time to that particular person. Just as the path is strategic, his way of teaching it was strategic too. Ooh. This is where I think, again, a lot of Westerners don't understand Buddhism. They associate these kind of mnemonic, however you say that word, words that people in the West have come to associate with the teachings of Buddha, like compassion. And they become kind of these catch-all BS kind of hooks, clickbait words. Like Buddhists just go around being nice to everybody and bowing and laughing and everything's hilarious. No, man. That's just not Buddhism, yo. You need to go back and you need to actually read the teachings. It was really, once again, this community is so lovely. And when I started this podcast, I cuss a lot. And when I was a teacher, I cussed a lot too. And in the West, particularly upper class people, I find, I grew up really poor. It's really interesting because I grew up homeless for the first several years of my life, pretty crazy, not healthy childhood. And then later in life, my older childhood was a very different fabricated experience. And, then I went on to school and got all the degrees and did all the crap that people do, right, to find right livelihood for myself. And I taught college. And I find that there's just a sentiment, there's a sentiment that Buddhism or concepts that are often associated with Buddhism, like mindfulness is another one of those words that oftentimes has kind of lost its meaning. That if you're using it in the, for mindfulness in Buddhism is one of the stones in the Eightfold Path. And oftentimes when you look at Western psychology, they're basically taking the same ideas that are in right mindfulness. Well, the problem with that is that you're taking it out of context. And are you sure you want to do that? I mean, here's a guy who's taught it for a long time, and thousands of years people have been doing it, and you're going to change it? It's like it's a little narcissistic when you think about it. You can hate me. You can't comment on my podcast. What are you going to do? Anywho, I'll hear about it on this Discord server. But at any rate, I was cussing in the earlier episodes, and I actually put a question on this Discord server, and I said, hey, could I get some advice? When I cussed in the classroom, I was doing it for the same reason that I'm doing it here. It's not to offend people, but it's a way to put an exclamation point. Well, maybe it is to a certain degree, but not because I'm trying to cause them harm. It's more because I care. I want them to hear this. This is really important. And that's because I'm Buddhist. This is how I've come up, since I was 25-ish. We're not always nice. And by the end of my teaching career, I found that my approach was not working for people. And it was no longer right livelihood for me. I talked about this last week, so I'm not going to bring it up again. So where I'm going with this is, Buddha spent a lot of time, and you'll see this in earlier episodes, earlier sections of the book, where he would talk about how discerning he was about who he taught. He didn't teach everybody. He was discerning. Discernment is incredibly important in Buddhism. And that's probably why, right? Because he was really interested. And one thing that you really do have to understand, I think, if one is to really decide to practice Buddhism, is that you will be emotionally uncomfortable. You will be physically uncomfortable. It is absolutely 100% guaranteed. And, not everybody is cool with that, and so anyway, I'm going to move on. But Buddha wasn't always nice, yo. Buddha, if he had a student that was BSing it or half-assing it, step up to the plate. What's going on with you? Is there a problem? Right? And it wasn't because Buddha was an a-hole. It was because Buddha was trying a strategy. It wasn't coming from anger. It was coming from strategy. Anywho, and I admit it, I'm not awake. I'm not a Buddha. So sometimes it was coming from anger for me. I admit it. All I can do is practice, right? How are we doing? Oh my gosh, I have 10 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna move on. Wow, you're still here. Wow, thank you. I'm gonna check the chat. We're doing great. Okay, again, feel free to interrupt me. If you have anything you want to ask or say, please help yourself. So we're now on the 3 levels of right view. Here we go. As we have mentioned several times, right view has 3 levels. The first 2, mundane and transcendent, and presented in MN 117. The 3rd level is nowhere named in the canon, but a handful of suttas describe it in enough detail to show that although it represents the final working out of transcendent right view, it forms a separate level that goes beyond it in several important respects. For the purposes of discussion, we will term it final right view. Ooh, okay. Here for each level of right view, we will first discuss the content of that level and the duties appropriate to it. Then we will contrast it with the wrong views that the Buddha criticized as deviating from it. This contrast helps to highlight where the line between right view and wrong view lies. We will also discuss how the Buddha taught people to progress from one level of right view to the next. Finally, we will discuss the causal principle that underlies all 3 levels of right view. This principle, it works together with the other factors of the path. I think I messed that up, but that's okay. All right. So mundane right view. Mundane right view centers on the issues of karma and rebirth. MN 117's definition of this level of right view is actually a negation of a set of tenets that DN2 attributes to one of the Buddha's contemporaries, a teacher named Ajita Kesakambalin. And again, I'm sorry if I killed that. Ajita taught a materialist doctrine that DN2 calls annihilationism, the belief that a person is simply a combination of material elements which are annihilated at death, and that good deeds such as generosity and gratitude to one's parents are a waste of time because everything ends up in annihilation anyhow. Interesting. I was not familiar with this concept. So the first implication of mundane right view is that generosity does matter. Gratitude to one's parents is a virtue, and that death is not annihilation. MN 117 states, these positions in very simple terms, there are fruits and results of good and bad actions. There is this world and the next world. There are spontaneously reborn beings. This is a reference to beings born in heaven or in hell, with no need for mother or father. And again, yes, this did come up in the suttas. And I believe the last episode or the episode before that, as we were finishing up chapter 2, yes, he specifically talks about it's, that is what is written there. And again, I gave my commentary on that, so I won't repeat it here. Other suttas expand considerably on these points. To begin with, on the topic of action, the Buddha defines the word for action, kama, in two senses. On the one hand, it is the intention underlying the act, and that's Sutta 57. On the other, it can also refer to the results of the act that return to the person who intentionally committed the act and that are experienced in the form of the six senses, Sutta 62. And so, again, talked about this in previous sections, and I think this is a really great, maybe, passage to contemplate or journal about if anybody out there is, interested in what Buddha had to say about Buddha the psychologist, basically, right? And again, this is what I've had to do for over 2 decades, right? Is, okay, phew, it's a reach for me. It's a stretch, right? I did not come up in a culture that believes that we recycle, right? So it's a stretch for me. But I think as you sit and as you practice, right, again, right concentration, right mindfulness, and you really practice and you start to kind of level it up as you were and become practiced with it, and you develop that sensitivity, then you do kind of start to see this idea that our own intentions, and again, this was talked about earlier, right, in the teachings when Buddha's talking to his son, and he's saying, hey, why do we do this, son? Because, this is how we're going to feel. And this is what, and if you don't feel this way, that's not good because other people do. And they see you and they're like, wow, what an a-hole, right? So go back and, look at earlier sections. These results tend to be painful or pleasant, depending on whether the intention in forming the act was unskillful, based on greed, aversion, or delusion. Talked about this last week, or skillful, based on a mind state free of those defilements. And again, we just talked about this, so I think it's in the last episode or right sections right before this. There is an apparent discrepancy in the suttas as to how completely old kama shapes sensory experience. Whew, boy, isn't this a hot topic? In SN 35:145, Sutta 62, the Buddha, when talking to the monks, states that all 6 sense media, ooh, you gotta love that, right? 6 sense media, right? Ooh, gives me chills just because that's like, what a great way to put that. All 6 sense media should be regarded as old kama. Yeah, dang it. Dang you, temper. However, in SN 3621, Sutta 66, when talking to, oh boy, Malayasivaka, sorry if I killed that, a wanderer of another sect, he states that not all feelings are the result of old kama. And then he offers a list of other sources for feelings, a list apparently drawn from the medical beliefs of the times. The fact that the second sutta is addressed to a member of another sect, however, leaves open the possibility that the Buddha chose this list to appeal to concepts that were not specifically Buddhist, and instead were common in non-Buddhist circles. And when we compare the discussion in SN 36:21 with that in SN 35:145, we see that the alternative causes listed in SN 36:21 all fall under the headings of new or old karma, listed in SN 35:145. Because SN 35:145, addressed to monks, is the more authoritative, I think it's how you say that, of the two suttas, this suggests that the list in SN 36:21 was simply meant as a refutation of fatalism, see below, and that if Maliyasivaka continued to pursue the issue, he might at a later point be more receptive to the Buddha's full-scale explanation of how karmic tendencies worked. And part of that explanation would have been that the input of the six senses should be all viewed as a form of past karma. Okay, I'm going to stop right here because it's almost the top of the hour, and boy, do I have a lot to say about this. And so I'll just say, before I close it out, that, we'll pick up next week on, at the top of this page, second paragraph. I've already talked about this in almost every single episode of this podcast. I'm very transparent about my past without shaming anyone in my family, because, that's not my job to do. And I love my parents very, very much. But I talk often about how, because of the kind of childhood that I had, and it was quite abusive, and other things that I experienced throughout my life, and probably because I experienced that kind of childhood, what we know in human psychology would be what we call the formative years, which is when the human brain, it's really important what we're feeding it. Going back to the idea of feeding it, the formative years. Why is it called formative? It's when the brain is the most formational. It's when it's changing and growing and learning the most. And so we can learn how to play the piano during the formative years. And we can also learn that to get what you want, you hurt and hit during the formative years. So there's that there's that level of it, right? But here, what Buddha is saying, and again, I've talked about this in the past, and this could be where people really have a problem with Buddhism, and I get it. And I get why Westerners would have a really big problem with, this is what, there's something called the law of attraction in the West that's very popular, and they say something, not really what Buddha was saying, but there's a general sentiment that's similar, which is that we attract everything. Okay, well, so yes, I mean, what Buddha here is saying is that it's karma ripening. So my father was abusive. I don't know. Things can be generational, right? The way we interact socially can be generational, the way we learn it. And then here, we're getting way out of my depth here, but I am assuming that he is also saying past lives. What did we do with our past lives? And again, this is where I just reserve the right to not know. I have had some weird experiences that I can't explain in a hypnotherapy session, and then I just choose to say, well, you know what? I don't need to know everything. I don't understand what this is, but maybe the Buddha's right. Okay, anywho. So I think I'll just stop right there. But hey, if you've got any questions or anything at all, and I'm going to stop the recording. So let me just kind of close it out. If you're listening, or if you did listen, thank you so much. I appreciate you. And I hope that you got something from the reading today. And I'm very excited that we're beginning with the Eightfold Path at the beginning of the year. And take good care.